I think it's time to go to this next session, which is the financing conservation, exploring alternative ways. We're right on time. And the speakers are Dr. Ian Redmond, who's right here next to me. And originally we had said Dr. Simon Zadek, but it's going to be Julie McCarthy, who's also the co-CEO of Nature Finance, same organization. Do we have Julie online?
I'm here. Can you all hear me okay?
We can hear you, but we can't. Oh, yeah, we can see you too.
Wonderful. I'll have to tell Simon that you called him sir. He'll be very impressed that we've added that to his title. What order would you like to go? I'm happy to proceed however you prefer.
You could start since Ian's been on the last panel. So.
Got it. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as was said, I'm filling in for my co-CEO at Nature Finance last minute. I'm really delighted to have the chance to share some thoughts with you today, and hopefully also hear from all of you in the Q&A and discussion. My name is Julie McCarthy. I'm co-CEO of Nature Finance. Nature Finance, for those who don't know, is a relatively new global nonprofit that works to align global finance with more nature-positive and equitable outcomes. You can check out our website to see our range of work. We're currently doing a lot on issues such as sustainability-linked debt, high-integrity nature markets and nature credits, nature risk and data and standards work, and work on nature-positive investments. I have been asked today, without being too technical, to share thoughts on the landscape of finance for nature, conservation, restoration right now, and how to bring in new sources, especially in the domain of private finance and financial markets. So let me take a stab at doing this. In our view at Nature Finance, financing the conservation and restoration of biodiversity in ways that can be sustained over time really requires a threefold strategy of channeling adequate finance into conservation and restoration, ensuring that nature's stewards, namely indigenous peoples, farmers, and local communities, are secure, incentivized, and well and fairly resourced, and transitioning to a nature positive as well as a decarbonized, climate resilient global economy overall. So as we know, this agenda has largely been institutionalized in global targets, such as Target 3 and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the 30 by 30 target. And as we know, there are many levers that need to be pulled in advancing the financing dimensions of this ambitious agenda. The key current sources of finance for biodiversity can really be categorized under three general approaches. There's public finance and philanthropic, there's the sort of blended innovative finance world, and then there's market-based approaches. Thinking about the public finance and philanthropic domain, obviously the most well-known and historically significant form of finance for biodiversity is conservation finance, the practice of channeling public or private philanthropic funds directly into conservation and restoration. These efforts are typically project-based. They recognize the intrinsic non-financial value of nature and have historically been a significant part of the overall biodiversity finance landscape. Domestic and international public finance comprises the largest source of biodiversity finance at present, around 75 to 85 billion USD per annum, according to the OECD's most recent estimate, which was about 5 years ago or so. This obviously falls far short of the estimated 700 billion per year required to fill the biodiversity finance gap. Beyond public and philanthropic support for ecosystem conservation and restoration, obviously you see green industrial strategies, green budgeting, green strategic public procurement. These are all additional strategies that governments are deploying in various ways with varying degrees of success to increase finance for biodiversity. And then there's some newer efforts in this domain, kind of mixing public finance and philanthropic finance, such as the Tropical Forest Forever Fund that was proposed by Brazil at COP28, which may provide new opportunities to harness sovereign contributions, specifically sovereign wealth fund contributions from fossil fuel producing countries to support biodiversity conservation at greater scale. There are also new developments in the domain of global taxation. So at COP28, a group of countries led by France and Kenya and supported by Brazil announced that they are exploring the potential for innovative international taxation approaches to finance climate and biodiversity, and they will deliver those recommendations at COP30 in Brazil. And then there are also new kind of big ticket philanthropic efforts like the Packard Foundation's Forest People Climate Initiative that's working to raise $2 billion towards the sort of social solidarity economy in nature-rich countries. They've raised about $700 million so far, and that will support local conservation and restoration efforts. So overall, a lot of effort in the public and philanthropic financing domain, largely by bilateral and multilateral donors, as well as private philanthropy. It's all critical, but it's not sufficient to protect and restore biodiversity at the scale that we need to see. So this leads us to market-based approaches to financing biodiversity and blended approaches. These are approaches that leverage market forces and economic incentives to promote investment in conservation and restoration while simultaneously hopefully generating revenue streams for these efforts. So I think we are seeing a lot of progress to systematically unlock and redirect finance for biodiversity. Nature credit markets are a very fast-moving and important example where we're seeing them move beyond carbon to include biodiversity credits as well, biocredits, as we tend to call them for shorthand. Have the potential to achieve the three kind of linked aims of channeling investments into conservation and restoration, incentivizing behavioral shifts in market actors, and supporting the roles and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities if and only if they're properly governed and can avoid the many pitfalls we have seen with carbon credit markets. There are several current efforts afoot to think through what high integrity, high impact biodiversity credits or biodiversity uplifted carbon credits could look like from a very practical kind of market design perspective. One such effort that we're involved in is this International Advisory Panel on Biocredits, made up of government, industry, nonprofits, and Indigenous representatives, which is going to deliver a set of recommendations and principles at COP16 in Colombia this year. Our own emerging view at Nature Finance is that biodiversity credit markets will likely only scale if countries start to generate demand. That could be through no net loss, net gain, comply or compensate policies applied at the sovereign level. So a country, for example, would set a national no net loss, net gain requirement for business and financial institutions where if they can't demonstrate that they have at least done no harm and at best made an improvement to a measured, independently verified state of nature assessment, then they need to pay compensation. And this could be in the form of a tax. It could be fines that get put into a special conservation fund. It could also be in the form of being required to purchase biocredits or biodiversity uplifted carbon credits that have been accredited nationally and follow a set of mutually agreed kind of high integrity principles. Another really interesting area where we've been doing a lot of work, as have others like TNC, for example, is around nature-linked sovereign financing instruments, which likewise can both incentivize positive nature outcomes and climate outcomes, provide critical reductions in debt servicing costs, especially for lower middle income countries, and also help to kind of sensitize markets to growing nature and climate related risks and opportunities. So one example is sustainability linked bonds. These are in the early stages of scaling. Chile and Uruguay have provided kind of early proofs of concept. Countries like Brazil, Kenya, Peru, Ghana, Slovenia are also now exploring these instruments. We think that SLBs, as we call them, sustainability-linked bonds, are an exciting innovation because they monetize government commitments to a set of nature and climate performance outcomes around, say, deforestation or wildlife species restoration or regenerative agriculture. And governments get a discounted interest rate if they meet their key performance indicators in that area. They get penalized in terms of an interest rate increase if they don't. And in turn, governments are in the driver's seat of setting these KPIs. It's not donors, it's not the market. Governments decide which KPIs they want to set and hopefully live up to. And likewise, the proceeds that are generated from these bonds are not earmarked for climate or biodiversity related outcomes. Governments have fiscal flexibility to use the proceeds of these bonds however they want, as long as they meet these ambitious targets. Debt for nature swaps are another tool that are use of proceeds instruments. So the savings that you get from the debt for nature swap, you put into specific sort of conservation projects that often with a third party holding the resources on behalf of the government. These are also increasingly popular, especially amongst debt distressed lower middle income countries. We've seen them in Barbados and Belize. And then a spin on these are species-related bonds, like the now well-known rhino bonds, which was grant funded by the World Bank to conserve and increase the population of endangered black rhinos. While this one was grant funded, one could imagine monetizing this kind of bond in a market-funded mechanism as well. People may also be aware that UNDP is working with private finance actors to try and move a tiger ecosystem bond forward in Bhutan, which is a really fascinating effort and would be the first instance of recognizing and trying to financially value the broader benefits to an ecosystem of species preservation activities. And they're actually linking in this bond proposal the tiger ecosystem bonds, biodiversity and carbon credits to the bond structure. So it's an interesting combination of financial instruments in this domain. A further iteration on this that we haven't seen, but that we've talked about at Nature Finance and imagined could be doing a similar kind of species protection bond at a retail level, meaning that you or I could purchase a share of a gorilla bond or a butterfly bond and effectively crowdsource finance for wildlife conservation at a local or even international retail level. It's obviously really important to note that given the global debt crisis, inflation, the food security crisis, so many different challenges, many African countries right now in particular are struggling to access global capital markets, which is why to take advantage of many of these instruments that I'm describing, credit enhancement from development finance institutions is also really key. Nature Finance is actually convening a working group on credit enhancement for sustainability-linked debt with all of the major multilateral development banks. We launched it at COP. The AFDB is included along with the AIB, the ADB, the IADB, all of the major stakeholders, and they will deliver hopefully a package that includes both streamlined mechanisms for countries to access credit enhancement, and also an uplift in the amount of credit enhancement that's mobilized in this area for these countries to avail themselves of sustainability-linked debt instruments. And then the last area I'll mention, which I heard, I think, Ian talking about at the end of the last session, in terms of finance for biodiversity, is around payment for ecosystem services, which in our view offers a really promising market-based approach with kind of global public good dimensions to incentivize sustainable resource management and generate all kinds of co-benefits for biodiversity, for climate change, for human well-being. Payment for ecosystem services schemes generally seek to address market failures by creating different kinds of financial incentives for landowners and communities or stewards of natural resources to adopt more sustainable practices that can preserve or enhance the provision of ecosystem services. So this can take the form of direct payments, tax credits, or access to specific markets or subsidies. And these schemes can be implemented at any scale, from a hyper-local community-based initiative to national or even international programs. So payment for ecosystem services, in addition to biocredits and sustainability-linked sovereign financing, are three major areas that illustrate, in our view, how it's possible to transition from the classical kind of grant-based conservation financing approach to a more systemic approach to nature finance that really leverages the private sector as well. The last thing that I want to say, in talking about all of the landscape of opportunities to generate new finance for biodiversity conservation and restoration, think we also need to reflect on how much can be accomplished by shifting existing activity amongst financial actors from what's often nature destructive practices to more nature positive ways of operating. And the key area that I wanted to point to right now is nature crime and the role of financial institutions in particular, and often unwittingly facilitating environmental crimes such as illegal wildlife trade and deforestation through their lending activities. Right now, there are very limited regulations about the kinds of due diligence that large banks, for example, need to do when they're making loans to companies that might quite easily be identified as high risk if the right set of flags were raised and people did just a little bit of digging. So we, along with many others, Traffic, Global Witness, World Wildlife Foundation, are all really pushing towards more mandatory mechanisms to require financial institutions to conduct due diligence around nature crime, all of their lending, and also to upskill and resource relevant government agencies, including financial crime units, to be able to recognize and investigate and enforce rules around this activity as part of their work. Big picture, redirecting our existing $92 trillion global economy towards more nature positive outcomes needs to, in our view, be as much a part of the conversation as how we generate the $700 billion per year in new resources we need to address the global biodiversity crisis. So I'll end with that, I guess, pass over to Ian. Thank you. Look forward to the Q&A and discussion.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so impressed by the eloquence with which you can bandy about all those terms. It's not my world, the finance world, but it has to become the world of conservationists, just as I would counter the financial world has to become aware of the conservation world, because there's only one world and we live in it. And the trouble is, we talk about the Earth and think about the big ball of rock, but it's just a thin film. The biosphere on the outside of the ball of rock, it's like the slime on a boulder. We live in the slime on the boulder. The Earth itself is not a home to us beneath the surface. It's just that thin little bit that somehow we have to keep healthy to sustain us all. I didn't do economics at school, I have to admit. And when I learned that economics teachers teach that nature is an externality, I was glad I didn't do economics at school, because rather than seeing nature as the foundation for all that we do, we've got this clever economic system over here and nature is over there. What? That isn't how a naturalist thinks, that isn't how indigenous people and local communities think, and it shouldn't be how the global economy thinks. So how are we going to change that? During the COVID pandemic, when we were all being locked in our homes and suddenly getting to grips with video calls and conferences, we suddenly found we could talk to people all over the world from our desk at home. And I was surprised to find myself having video calls with a blockchain specialist in London called Walid Al-Sakaf, Ralph Sharmy, who was at the time the assistant director of the International Monetary Fund, and me. And the three of us were building on some work done by an Italian biologist called Fabio Berzaghi. And Fabio, in 2019, published a study that compared a forest in the DRC, sorry, I was indicating the minister, he's not there, and a forest in Congo, the other Congo, one with elephants and one where the elephants had been extirpated decades ago. And he found that the above-ground biomass, also known as wood, in the forest with elephants was 7% more than without. And that suggests that there's a measurable difference that elephants make. And he's subsequently gone on to say, well, actually, it's more like 7 to 14%. And once you start calculating the gigatons of carbon stored in the Congo Basin rainforests, 7% of a gigaton is still a lot of carbon. And at the price of carbon on the international markets in 2019, Ralph Sharmy calculated that each individual elephant was responsible for the additional sequestration and storage of $1.75 million worth of carbon. The price on the international carbon market has more than tripled since then. So the life work of an elephant over 60 or so years results in more carbon being stored in the forests. It's not just elephants, of course. All the animals in a forest are enhancing that forest ability because they're part of the forest. The general public tends to think that there's a forest and then you might put some animals in it. But the forest wouldn't be there without the animals because they're the ones who disperse the seeds to plant the trees of tomorrow. And when you stand next to an amazing 5, 6, 7, 800-year-old tree in the Congo Basin, what you're looking at is the outcome of an ecological event where a gorilla, or an elephant, or perhaps a hornbill swallowed a seed and pooped it out the other end, and then it grew. And of course, most of the billions of seeds don't grow into massive trees, otherwise there wouldn't be any room for anything else. They get eaten, so they're providing food for the terrestrial herbivores in the forest, and once they get big enough, food for the primates that are clambering in the canopy. And all that ecosystem, as we mentioned earlier, is putting water vapor into the atmosphere and sending it around the world. Now, the $1.75 million per elephant price tag is not the elephant itself. You can't take an elephant out of the forest, chain it to a tree and say, right, give me loads of money. It has to be in its ecosystem, doing its daily work. Hashtag gardeners of the forest and savanna, because obviously elephants live on savanna as well. And so do the other species that disperse seeds that grow into trees or are eaten by other herbivores. And they also produce a lot of poo. I have to talk about the positive power of poo when we're talking about world global economics. Because you think it's money that makes the world go round? No, it is the recycling of nutrients. Dung, excrement, pick your choice of words, but that is what makes the soil fertile. And when you think that a century and a half ago, there were, some estimates say 10 million, some estimates say 25 million elephants. Let's go with the 10 millions because the sums are easier. If there were 10 million elephants, and each elephant eats about 4% of his or her body weight a day, so a 5-ton elephant is producing about 200 kilograms of dung, which means that every week, you might estimate for the sake of convenience, elephants are producing about 1 metric ton of dung, packed with nutrients, fertilizing the soils. So 100 years ago, 10 million elephants. Now, best estimates maybe 400,000. So we've lost 96% of the mega gardeners of the forest already. So the soils of Africa are not being fertilized. Uncountable trillions of trees are not being planted because we've lost the elephants. And still nobody puts a living elephant is worth nothing unless you can take a tourist to see it, and then you get a bit of tourism money, but then there's a pandemic or a war or terrorist atrocity and the tourists stop coming. And then what happens to your conservation? You've got no money. And yet the elephant is providing a service to the world that no one is paying for. So the Rebalance Earth concept, rebalance.earth is the website, was that we could use a blockchain mechanism to have companies that want to balance their nature footprint. And I thought you were leading up, Julia, towards the end of your talk to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. What a lovely phrase to utter. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is happening because corporate leaders are realizing that they cannot take nature for granted. And customers are demanding corporate leaders to be more responsible and not just reduce the damage they're doing, but perhaps go for net positive. And some of the more advanced thinking companies are doing exactly that. I watched a film the other day called Beyond Zero. Look it up. It's an hour-and-a-half documentary about a carpet tile company that 30 years ago decided to stop making carpet tiles that you could put in the compost and they'd still be a carpet tile 2 years later. Basically, carpet tiles for centuries ending up in landfill and degrading down to microplastics and ending up in our food chains, but instead started to make biodegradable carpet tiles and use some biomimicry to reduce the use of poisonous glues to stick them down. It's a great film. I really enjoyed it. Recommend it. But more companies are doing that. And what this company found was that when they went green, their sales went up because the customers want it. So market-driven economic solutions are going to be driven by people. I do a lot of work with the Born Free Foundation as well as Ecoflix. We'll come on to Ecoflix later because I hope David Castleman, our CEO, is in the wings waiting to speak. But Born Free have an educational tool where every year they do a great debate. And a couple of years ago it was on chocolate. And chocolate matters to kids because if you have pocket money as a child, you go to the shop and you buy chocolate. And we were saying to the children, do you know that if you buy some chocolates, your money is paying for child labor and deforestation and chimpanzees and elephants losing their home so that you can have a cheap bar of chocolate? But other chocolates have been certified as rainforest friendly. So do you buy a cheap bar of chocolate or do you spend a bit more? Why do you have to spend a bit more? Why are we sort of subsidizing the companies that don't have a responsible attitude by the economy of scale? They produce such large quantities that they can reduce the price, and the companies that are trying to do the right thing have to sell it to a niche market of people who care. No, we all have to become ethical shoppers and look for certified timber or paper. FSC ideally is the best independent certification. It has its problems, isn't perfect, none of these systems are, but certified palm oil, certified soy, all those questions have to be answered. And when a company does its TNFD assessment, it's looking not just at the procurement of the raw materials and the manufacture of the product and the shipping of the product to the shops, but also the lifespan of the product and what happens to that product when it's no longer useful. Is it being recycled? And that is changing the global economy, but probably too slowly to achieve what we need in the time available. So, as I alluded earlier, if we can develop a system, and Rebalance Earth initially got a very positive response from the corporates that we spoke to, who loved the idea of having client elephants, fertilizing the soils, and communities that were benefiting through blockchain for their money that they bought for these services of these elephants. But then they discovered that the elephants live in countries that are sometimes very difficult to work in. Many African countries suffer from civil unrest, civil war. And at the moment, Rebalance Earth is having to build its model on ecosystems in the UK, where the corporate world feels more comfortable spending its money. So again, we're back to looking for philanthropic or aid money to set up the pilot projects in the DRC or in Liberia or wherever there are forest elephants to demonstrate that. But just think a little way into the future that when you buy a bottle of wine or a laptop or you pay your Lecky bill, a part of that payment is already gone to pay for the services of keystone species, be they in the oceans or in the forests or on the savannah, so that the communities that live alongside them and in those ecosystems are benefiting and improving their quality of life. And it's not charity money. Have you got a bit of money left at the end of the month that you can give to a charity? Will it be a charity for old people or for children, for animals, domestic animals or wild animals? You're getting a subset of a subset of a subset to meet that 700 billion biodiversity funding gap. It isn't going to work. What about government money, public purse? Governments have to deal with education, with health, with transport, with defense, all the people stuff, and the environment is somewhere at the bottom. So again, a subset of already overburdened tax money isn't the solution. It has to be the global economy that starts to be reconfigured so that we value living nature, as Ralph Sharma would say. I'm trying to stream Ralph, IMF economist. Is that my bell to tell me to shut up? Oh, I see. Okay. So I'm streaming Ralph Sharma saying we have to value living nature and build an economy that does that. If a biologist says that, people say, yeah, what does he know? But if the former assistant director of the International Monetary Fund says that, people listen. And the economics professors that Ralph co-authors papers with in the top journals have the respect of the world's economists and corporate leaders. So I think we're going to do it. The only question is, are we going to do it fast enough? And that's why it's really good that we're having this discussion here. And our chair lady is no longer next to me. So I'm going to say, well, does anyone want to pick up on any of these themes right now? And David Castleman, are you there in the wings ready to talk about elephants and carbon?
I am indeed.
Hey, David. Then I'm going to turn my mic off. And Julia, if you want, I don't know who's in charge of the remote video thing, but let's have David on screen. And don't go away, Julia. We will continue this discussion, I'm sure.